Today I'm going to be reviewing percentages. Exercise 2A from your textbook. When we're reviewing our percentages, we need to remember that we're dealing with it being out of 100. So typically you're trying to get the denominator to be 100 in order to make it into a percentage. If we have a look at the very first example and part A of this example, it's 19 over 20. Now 20 is a number that we can actually change to be over 100. We can make it to be 100 by timesing it by 5. With fractions, remember it's what you do to the bottom, you do to the top. So if I'm multiplying the bottom to be by 5 to be 100, if I go 19 times 5, that will end up being 95 over 100, which in turn allows me to know that it's 95%. Remember, the question has asked us to write each of the following as a percentage. So if the fraction's nice and easy that way, and you can see that you need to times it by 5 or whatever number needs to be times to make it 100, that's fine. But if we have now look at B, which is 3 over 8, 8 is a little bit trickier to make to be 100. Now you can actually do it by multiplying it to be 1,000. Just makes it the process a little bit longer. So you could multiply 8 by 125 to get it to be 1,000. Or if the fraction is not as nice as part A was, you can multiply it by 100. So if you ever want to get a fraction or a decimal to be a percentage, you can multiply it by 100. Part of this process is I want that 100 now to be a fraction itself. To make it a fraction, you just put it over 1. Okay? So any whole number to a fraction, you just put it over 1. Now we're in this position where I can go 3 times 100 and then 8 times 1. But before I start that process, what might be easier is to simplify, cross-simplify wherever I can, just to make those numbers a little bit smaller. I know if I divide 8 by 2 and 100 by 2, I'm going to make these numbers a little bit smaller. Now you could go to the next step, but I'm just going to do this a little bit slowly. 8 divided by 2 gets me 4. 100 divided by 2 gets me 50. And 3 and the 1 just stay as it is. But once again, as I'm getting these numbers a little bit smaller, I can see I can do it again. I can divide the 4 by 2 and the 50 by 2. Which now allows me to have 3 over 2 times 25 over 1. Much nicer, much easier to deal with when I'm doing my multiplication of my top numbers and my multiplication of my bottom numbers. So once I go 3 times 25, that gets me 75. And 2 times 1 gets me 2. How many times can 2 go into 75? Well, that allows it to be 37.5%. Or you can write it as a decimal, but feel super confident when you're converting to a decimal. 37.5 is also acceptable with the percent sign. So it's a little bit longer than what we did in A. However, the process, if you take your time, if you're maybe not that strong with your multiplication skills or your times tables, just slowly make it smaller before you multiply the two fractions together. It will make your life maybe a little bit easier. Then with C, when we're dealing with a decimal, remember, changing it into a percentage, you will always be timesing by 100. Look at the 2 zeros that I have on my 100. That's how I know how many times my decimal point is going to move to the right. Okay? So the decimal point is going to jump 1, 2 to the right. And then I know my answer is 7%. And that is my